Hello, folks. Like many other Khazan enthusiasts, I too very recently entered into the Great General's Crucible, only to have my shoelaces tied together, my pants quickly pulled up over my head, and a fire hydrant sized firework shoved up my arse. The difficulty is pretty brutal to say the least, and the DLC itself has caused quite the divide within the Khazan community already. Some players think it's spot on, some are impartial, and others think it's hot garbage. Regardless of opinion, I try to stay mostly neutral on this platform, but today's video might just be my most opinionated yet. Don't expect nothing too crazy, but I can't do this topic justice while sitting on a fence and not pitching in with my own thoughts and feelings. So first off, let's simplify the controversy here because it's not terribly complicated. Khazan released roughly 8 weeks ago. Since then, it has received 3 hotfixes and 3 patches. They've mostly solved a mountain of issues, added tons of quality of life that arguably should have been there from the start, and we've been teased since launch that we were to expect some upcoming DLC. Well, the third and most recent patch did include said DLC, which is essentially 2 boss rush modes that can only be accessed after having completed the main game. One is titled Berserker's Bloodshed, which is the more forgiving of the two. It also offers better rewards and more replayability. The other mode is titled Great General's Crucible, and despite the entire DLC receiving backlash, it would seem that a large portion of it stems from this game mode in particular. Now, in this game mode, you're forced to take on groups made of up to 3 or 4 bosses, one after the other. You're given no additional healing between those bosses. Your damage output is very low due to having your entire build forced upon you, all whilst the boss's HP bars seem to be turned up to New Game Plus Plus. Berserker's Bloodshed isn't all that different, but luck plays a large factor in available gear and build options, and thus how effective any individual run can be, meaning it may not be as tough as Great General's Crucible, but it is still very difficult, and overall makes the entire DLC very challenging for Khazan's average player base, which would be most of us. I don't want to undersell the difficulty here, so let me just make this abundantly clear. This isn't Consort Radahn levels of difficulty we're talking about here. This is Rune level 1, no hit Consort Radahn levels of difficulty, and this DLC will force you to become an exceptional player and beyond if you ever stand a chance of completing it. So with all of that said, it shouldn't come as any surprise that a significant portion of the player base is upset by the difficulty here, as it simply makes this content quite inaccessible to themselves. To completely write off this content, however, and call it trash within the first 48 hours of it releasing is a somewhat inconsiderate take towards a portion of the player base and an otherwise very respectful dev team, not to mention that it completely fails to recognise the core spirit of this genre of games, which is difficulty. It's important to note that the writing was on the wall whenever Khazan's DLC was mentioned by the developers, in which they explicitly said this DLC will be harder than the base game and we can all expect a challenge. I guess wording is key here, as everyone's perception of challenge is bound to be different, but at least we can all agree that if anything, this DLC is most definitely challenging. Now, it would be hypocritical and inconsiderate of myself to not appreciate and take genuine concerns into account. Some players just genuinely love the game and feel upset that the difficulty spike does feel so damn steep, and I can completely appreciate this. You're simply frustrated because you want to enjoy the DLC, but it just feels like an impossible challenge, and I do sympathise, as I myself may never actually be able to complete this, in which case a part of me wants to suck it up and move on. But if I'm being honest, whilst this DLC caters to a minority of the Khazan player base, it doesn't serve the majority to any degree at all, and I think that's where the developers have gone wrong. Could the DLC use slight adjustments? I would obviously say yes. I personally wouldn't want to change much that's already there, but I would have introduced a more forgiving third mode that possibly offered a bit more replayability so as to help ease players into the harder difficulties, or even a difficulty modifier for just Berserker's Bloodshed would have allowed so much more accessibility than what we currently have. And I think this is what highlights the DLC's difficulty so much. There is no middle ground between the base game and the DLC. You have either very manageable due to available options, or you have very difficult that relies almost entirely on skill. Having some degree of middle ground here would have helped the DLC go over well with almost the entire player base, and far less players would have been upset upon realizing just how difficult all of the new content was going to be. Now, as much as this sounds like a good idea, people aren't required to do anything in any particular way, and choosing to cater to one part of the audience in particular isn't to spite any other parts at all. It's simply just to create something with those players in mind. However, do I think this was a particularly wise or quote-unquote good idea? I'd say not at all. By Nexon's own admission, Khazan had not performed as well as they had hoped for, and thus our little community is somewhat small in the grand scheme of things. Releasing DLC that appeals to an even smaller portion of that audience is obviously not great for long-term player retention. The amount of players that will have returned to this DLC and then immediately put it back down again will have been the majority, and also the bad taste that will have been left with those players will now dampen the excitement of returning to any future DLC, and ultimately, despite this being a free DLC, it's the first bad move we have seen Neeple make thus far. Now, I myself have been tussling with whether I want to complete this DLC or not, but I think that's also where part of my opinion stems from, which is we can take this or leave it. But as true as that may be, do we really want 80% or more of the player base to actually leave it right now, subsequently killing the game's future and damaging Neeple's future in the process? You can't argue the difficulty is just fine when you belong in the minority, but you also can't argue that it should be made much easier for yourself. Otherwise, someone will always be left out. Ultimately, what we want is for everyone to be happy and as many people playing this game as possible. Catering to a particular audience is fine, but leaving out the majority of your player base and fumbling any kind of resurgence that this free DLC could have had is a complete misfortune for the entire Khazan community right now. Now, we haven't touched on the rewards here at all, and nor do I really plan to. The rewards are largely subjective. Underwhelming as they may seem, some players will think this is fine, some won't, and others will see completing the challenges as a reward in and of itself. I think the general consensus is that attempting these challenges as the average player would pretty much only be for the rewards themselves, and they currently are just not worth attempting such a difficult challenge for, which isn't an unreasonable stance to have, and is very similar to how I personally feel. The main issue here is still the DLC's lack of accessibility to the majority of the player base, but as you can see, even the rewards themselves do play a small part in this. Now, we have received word from Sir Jun-Ho Lee himself in regards to the recent DLC's backlash, and I'll read this out word for word for you folks. Hello, this is Jun-Ho Lee. The two newly introduced highest difficulty boss modes were specifically designed as challenges for hardcore players. We've been closely monitoring a side range of feedback from various communities and channels regarding those new modes, and when reviewing these responses and data, there are certainly moments where we feel tempted to adjust the difficulty. Even now, part of me thinks, should we make it easier? But I'm deliberately holding back from making quick adjustments, and here is why. Realistically, it's challenging for a single piece of content to satisfy everyone's preferences. Therefore, our approach is to offer a variety of content tailored to different player needs and preferences, something like a buffet. The recent content update is like an extremely spicy dish, and rather than diluting this spiciness, we've chosen to refine it further to satisfy those who specifically enjoy this intense challenge. Of course, we don't intend to offer only spicy dishes just because we're making a hardcore action game. We're preparing content of various difficulties as well. This includes very casual experiences, modes slightly more challenging than our current standard difficulty, yet easier than the boss rush, and even more intense difficulty modes. Regarding yesterday's boss rush update, we're actively monitoring initial reactions, difficulty feedback, and suggestions about convenience from various communities. Whilst maintaining the intended difficulty and concept, we are committed to improving convenience and overall enjoyment. We'll continue to listen carefully to our players' diverse opinions and strive to deliver even better gaming experiences. Thank you. So, there we have it, folks, from the Commander-in-Chief's mouth himself. Now, do I agree with this? Not entirely. I appreciate this isn't the only DLC we will receive, and I appreciate the focus on making this DLC challenging, but I still completely stick to my guns that a middle ground should also have been implemented. I'm not pointing the finger and saying you've purposely overlooked us. How dare you? I'm simply just saying you have completely mishandled this situation, and where there could have been lots of excitement and hype for the game, it's instead being replaced with empty space and disappointment. Not because the DLC is bad, mind you, but just because it's inaccessible to the vast majority of us. We could have potentially been spending the next few weeks or months playing through this DLC whilst awaiting further news on future DLC, whereas now a large part of us will just simply move on and future DLC engagement will subsequently be lower. It certainly makes my job harder, and unless Neeple were banking on the controversial hype here, which I don't think they were, then all in all, this has been a bad experience for almost everyone involved, and I'm sad to report that this is the first real bit of disappointing news that I have ever reported for Khazan. So very sad times indeed. Before we wrap up, folks, I did host a poll to get a rough idea of everyone's feelings towards the DLC, and a significant portion didn't even know it existed. Regardless, the community does seem pretty split, but do not let these numbers sway you, as we would need a bigger sample size to get any kind of accurate idea. Overall, I'm not dissatisfied with this DLC. I just find it underwhelming and a complete missed opportunity to keep the entire player base engaged. It serves a specific purpose, but with slight adjustments, this could have been a lot more accessible, and thus, Khazan would have stayed a little bit more relevant as time inevitably passes on by. Anyway, that is it for this video, folks. I do have a range of guides and news videos on the channel, so do feel free to stop on by and check things out. Otherwise, thanks for watching, folks, and until next time, peace.